2023 Turkey-Syria earthquake. On the 6th of February 2023, at 4:17 TRT, a MW 7.8 earthquake struck southern and central Turkey and northern and western Syria. The epicenter was 37 kilometers west-northwest of Gaziantep. The earthquake had a maximum Mercalli intensity of 12 in parts of Antakya in Hatay province. It was followed by a MW 7.7 earthquake at 1324. This earthquake was centered 95 kilometers north-northeast from the first. There was widespread damage and tens of thousands of fatalities. The MW 7.8 earthquake is the largest in Turkey since the 1939 Erzincan earthquake of the same magnitude, and jointly the second strongest recorded in the history of the country, after the 1668 North Anatolia earthquake. It is also one of the strongest earthquakes ever recorded in the Levant. It was felt as far as Egypt and the Black Sea coast of Turkey. There were more than 10,000 aftershocks in the 3 weeks that followed. The seismic sequence was the result of shallow strike-slip faulting. There was widespread damage in an area of about 350,000 kilometers. An estimated 14 million people, or 16% of Turkey's population, were affected. Development experts from the United Nations estimated that about 1.5 million people were left homeless. As of the 20th of March 2023, more than 57,300 deaths were confirmed, more than 50,000 in Turkey, and more than 7,200 in Syria. It is the deadliest earthquake in what is present-day Turkey since the 526 Antioch earthquake, making it the deadliest natural disaster in its modern history. It is also the deadliest in what is present-day Syria since the 1822 Aleppo earthquake, the deadliest worldwide since the 2010 Haiti earthquake, and the fifth deadliest of the 21st century. Damages were estimated to be $104 billion in Turkey and $5.1 billion in Syria, making them the fourth costliest earthquakes on record. Damaged roads, winter storms, and disruption to communications hampered the Disaster and Emergency Management Presidency's rescue and relief effort, which included a 60,000-strong search and rescue force, 5,000 health workers and 30,000 volunteers. Following Turkey's call for international help, more than 141,000 people from 94 countries joined the rescue effort. Tectonic setting. Geology. Central southern Turkey and northwestern Syria are affected by the interaction between three tectonic plates, the African plate, the Arabian plate and the Anatolian plate. The boundary between the African and Arabian plates is formed by the Dead Sea Transform, which is a major zone of left lateral strike slip that accommodates the relative northward movement of Arabia with respect to Africa. The northern end of the DST truncates at the East Anatolian Fault, another major zone of left lateral strike slip that accommodates the overall westward movement of the Anatolian plate as it is extruded in that direction by the northward movement of the Arabian plate. The DST and EAF meet at the Marish Triple Junction. The EAF continues west of the Triple Junction, forming the boundary between the African and Anatolian plates, linking into the Cyprus Arc to the west via the Latakia Ridge. The 700-kilometer-long East Anatolian Fault has been subdivided into 7 segments. From the northeast the Karliova, Ilika, Palu, Puterj, Erkanik, Pazarchik and Amanos. The Amanos segment is also considered to be part of the DST by some workers, or a transitional structure between the EAF and DST by others. A northern strand to the EAF has also been recognized, including the Surgu, Kardak, Savran, Kokak, Toprakale, Umortalik, Karatas, Yakupiner and Duzici Iskenderun segments. The estimated slip rate on the main strand of the EAF system decreases southwestwards from 10 mm per year on the Karliova segment down to 2.9 mm per year on the Amanos segment. On the northern strand, slip rates of 2.5 mm per year have been estimated on the Kardak segment. The northern part of the Dead Sea Transform has been subdivided into several segments, although there is some disagreement between workers as to which faults should be assigned to the DST and which to the EAF, at the northernmost end of the structure. Following the 2013 active fault map of Turkey, 7 DST segments are recognized in Turkey and neighboring parts of Syria: the Afrin, Sarmata, Armanas, Hasipasa, Yesemek, Sakkagos and Narli segments. Seismicity. The EAF has produced large or damaging earthquakes in the past few hundred years on the various segments, including the 1789, 1795, 1872, 1874, 1875, 1893, 1971 and 2020 events. Other large historical earthquakes have been tentatively assigned to segments of the EAF, such as the 1114 and 1513 Marish earthquakes, both thought to have ruptured the Pazarchik segment. The Palu and Puterj segments in the east display a recurrence interval of about 150 years for M6.8 to 7.0 earthquakes. The Pazarchik and Amanos segments in the west have recurrence intervals of 237 to 772 years and 414 to 917 years, respectively, for M7.0 to 7.4 earthquakes. Large earthquakes on the northern part of the DST include events in 115, 526, 587, 1138, 1170 and 1822, which resulted in several tens of thousands to several hundreds of thousands of fatalities. Earthquake sequence. MW 7.8 earthquake at 1:17 Coordinated Universal Time. The first and largest earthquake in the sequence struck at 1:17 Coordinated Universal Time. The United States Geological Survey and Global Centroid Moment Tensor measured it at moment magnitude MWW 7.8 and MW 7.8, respectively. Geoscope reported a magnitude of MW 8.0 and Candeli Observatory reported a magnitude of MW 7.7 and ML 7.4. It had an epicenter at 37.166 degrees north, 37.032 degrees east, 34 kilometers west of Gaziantep in Gaziantep province, which is near the border with Syria. The earthquake hypocenter was at a depth of 10.0 kilometers according to USGS and 5 kilometers according to KOERI. The shock had a focal mechanism corresponding to strike-slip faulting. It is one of the strongest ever recorded in Turkey, equivalent in magnitude to the 1939 Erzincan earthquake. These earthquakes are surpassed only by the larger estimates for the 1668 North Anatolia earthquake. Globally, it was the strongest recorded since August 2021. MW 7.7 earthquake at 10:24 Coordinated Universal Time. Later that day at 10:24 Coordinated Universal Time, an earthquake measuring MWW 7.5 according to USGS, MW 7.6 according to KOERI, or MW 7.7 according to Geoscope and the GCMT, struck with an epicenter near Akinozu, 95 kilometers northeast of the M7.8 event. It had a depth of 15 kilometers according to the USGS, 5 kilometers by KOERI, and 13 kilometers by Geoscope. According to Candeli Observatory, the maximum MMI of the main shock was estimated to have reached MMI 1112 in Antakya. The MMI also reached XX in Kahramanmaraş and Iskenderun, 8X in Malatya and Adıyaman, 7.8 in Gaziantep, Kilis, Idlib and Aleppo, and V7 in Adana and Şanlıurfa. The maximum MMI of the second earthquake was X. Aftershocks. Over 570 aftershocks were recorded within 24 hours of the MW 7.8 earthquake and 10,000 recorded 3 weeks later. An aftershock measuring MWW 6.7 occurred about 11 minutes after the main shock. There were 25 aftershocks MW 4.0 or greater recorded within 6 hours of the main tremor, according to the USGS. More than 12 hours later, the USGS had reported at least 54 aftershocks of 4.3 or greater magnitude, while the Turkish Disaster and Emergency Management Presidency recorded at least 120 total aftershocks. A MWW 6.3 aftershock struck near Uzunbag in Hatay province on the 20th of February. The earthquake was the result of oblique normal faulting. The MW 7.7 earthquake triggered its own aftershock sequence, including 2 MB 6.0 aftershocks. Aftershocks of the second earthquake continued through at least the 9th of February. Seismology. MW 7.8 finite fault. MW 7.7 finite fault. A source model for the MWW 7.8 earthquake produced by the USGS from observed seismic waves, taking into account preliminary rupture mapping from satellite data, uses 3 fault segments with individual lengths, widths, strikes and dips of greater than 40 km times 30 km, 028 degree, 85 degrees, greater than 175 km times 30 km, 060 degree, 85 degrees and greater than 160 km times 20 km, 025 degree, 75 degrees. The main shock produced a maximum slip of 11.2 meters along segment 2, beneath Sakarya in Kahramanmaraş province, northeast of the junction where it meets segment 1. Another zone of large slip estimated at 4.96 meters occurred further northeast along segment 2, northwest of Adıyaman. The USGS source model for the MW 7.7 earthquake which struck 9 hours later has 3 large fault segments with individual lengths, widths, strikes and dips of greater than 70 km times greater than 20 km, 276 degrees, 80 degrees, greater than 40 km times greater than 20 km, 250 degrees, 80 degrees and approximately 80 km times greater than 20 km, 060 degree, 80 degrees. Maximum displacement occurred on segment 1 at 11.4 meters. Preliminary analysis of the effects of stress changes caused by the M7.8 earthquake on the Kardak-Surgu fault, based on the USGS fault model, indicated up to 3 bars of added stress near the epicenter of the M7.7 shock, sufficient to trigger rupture on that zone, assuming that it was already close to failure. Surface rupture. The extent of surface ruptures associated with the M7.8 and M7.7 earthquakes have been mapped using a mixture of satellite imagery and ground observations. Pixel matching on images captured by Sentinel-1 before and after the earthquakes showed sharp discontinuities in displacement, revealing 2 separate zones of surface rupture. The longer of the pair, produced by the first earthquake, measured 300 kilometers while the second earthquake produced 125 kilometers of surface rupture. These observations were backed up with direct imaging of the ruptures using other satellite data, such as from the Digital Globes Worldview 1, 2 and 3 and GEOEYE1, and by fieldwork. The zone of surface rupture extended from north of Antakya, Hatay province towards Pazarcık, Kahramanmaraş province and Gölbaşı, Adıyaman province. Surface ruptures continued north of these cities. Surface rupture occurred in the Amak Valley. The westernmost part of Hatay Airport was damaged by surface ruptures, but cracks in the runway were attributed to ground deformation. A major canal was damaged and led to flooding in parts of the Amak Valley, which was formerly Lake Amak. Field observations indicate a maximum displacement of 7.3 meters on the surface. Geologists traced a 15-kilometer surface rupture trending south from Pazarchik with an offset of 2.5 meters. From Golbasi to Nerdagi, ground displacements were up to 5 meters. The surface rupture observed during the M7.8 earthquake was unusually large, comparable to that during the 1906 San Francisco earthquake along the San Andreas Fault. Rupture propagation. Preliminary analysis based on seismology and observations of surface rupture suggests the following sequence of events. Initial rupture at the site of the epicenter of the M7.8 shock on the Gnarly Fault, the northernmost section of the Dead Sea Transform. The fault ruptured unilaterally northwards until it reached the Pazarchik segment of the East Anatolian Fault. Ruptures then continued bilaterally to the northeast and southwest along this segment. To the northeast, the rupture continued onto the Ekernik segment, and to the southwest onto the Amanos segment. A MW 6.8 aftershock occurring 11 minutes later and west of the first M7 epicenter may have ruptured along the Sakkagos Fault, the next segment of the Dead Sea Transform to the south. Rupture along the EAF during the event occurred at subshear velocity. A preliminary analysis of near-field seismic records indicates that the initial rupture speed transitioned to supershear over a distance of about 19.5 kilometers before it reached the EAF. The second M7 earthquake initiated on a separate fault known as the Kardak-Surgu Fault Zone, part of the northern strand of the East Anatolian Fault. The rupture propagated bilaterally along the Kardak segment, continuing eastwards onto the Surgu segment before continuing eastwards to Malatya along the northeast-southwest trending Dogan-Shahir Fault Zone. Rupture also propagated towards the southwest along the Kardak segment. The total rupture length was estimated at 160 kilometers. The westward propagating rupture occurred at supershear velocity while the eastward propagating rupture occurred at subshear velocity. Ground motion. Ground acceleration values recorded in some areas near the fault rupture were in excess of 1 gram. 3 USGS seismic installations, 2 at Antakya and 1 at Hassa, recorded large ground accelerations and velocities. The town of Hassa recorded 0.9082 grams in ground acceleration and 215.34 centimeters per second in ground velocity. The station data corresponded to a modified Mercalli intensity of X. The peak ground acceleration was 1.62 grams recorded by a station at Favzapasa. The maximum peak ground velocity was recorded at 215 centimeters per second in Hassa. Geological effects. Liquefaction was identified via satellite and remote sensing along the southern portion of the MW 7.8 rupture on the East Anatolian Fault from Antakya to Golbasi. Liquefaction and lateral spreading were observed at and near coastal areas, fluvial valleys and drained lake or swamp areas, covered by Holocene sediments. These effects were widespread in the Amak Valley and Orontes River Plain, north of Antakya, Hatay Province. Limited observations were made in high elevation areas due to snow cover and lack of satellite observations. Subsidence due to lateral spreading caused extensive damage to Iskenderun, where the sea inundated parts of the city by as much as 200 meters. Large areas of the coast and sections of piers were flooded due to lateral spreading. Liquefaction was also observed in Samandag. At Lake Golbasi, Adiyaman Province, lateral spreading occurred along the northern, eastern and southern coast. Parts of the lakeshore were also submerged. Golbasi was also damaged by liquefaction and lateral spreading. Large waves from bad weather, and a tsunami may have contributed to the effects observed at Iskenderun. Despite an epicenter 90 kilometers inland, a tsunami was recorded in the Mediterranean Sea. Small tsunami waves were recorded off the coast of Famagusta, Cyprus, without damage. The tsunami measured 0.17 meters, and tsunami waves were recorded at 0.12 meters at Iskenderun and 0.13 meters at Erdemli. Tsunami warnings were issued for the southern Turkish coast, southern and eastern Italian coasts and the whole eastern Mediterranean Sea area, but later withdrawn. Damage and casualties. In Turkey, there were at least 50,096 deaths and 115,000 injured across 11 provinces of Turkey. At least 13.5 million people and 4 million buildings were affected. About 345,000 apartments were destroyed. Thousands were trapped under rubble when buildings collapsed. Many people were missing in collapsed buildings. Survivors trapped under rubble live streamed their pleas for help on social media. By the 23rd of February 2023, the Ministry of Environment, Urbanization and Climate Change conducted damage inspections for 1.25 million buildings, revealing 164,000 buildings were either destroyed or severely damaged. A further 150,000 commercial infrastructure were at least moderately damaged. The International Organization for Migration estimated about 2.7 million people were made homeless. A damage assessment by the Turkish government revealed at least 61,722 buildings had to be demolished, including 11,900 in Gaziantep province, 10,900 in Hatay province, 10,800 in Kahramanmaraş province and 28,914 in Malatya province. Broad fissures appeared on roads. During recovery efforts, Body parts were often found in the rubble. In Adana, 12 buildings collapsed in the city center, 23 were badly damaged and 120 were moderately damaged. 3 apartments were among the buildings that collapsed in the city. Across Adana province, damage assessments revealed 59 buildings and 1,274 apartments were destroyed or required demolition. At least 300 buildings were razed in Malatya. 60% of the city's buildings received damage. Nearly every neighborhood of the city was affected by collapsed buildings. 2 hotels collapsed in the city, causing many casualties. The ceiling of Malatya Erhach Airport experienced a partial collapse, as did the historic Yeni Kami Mosque. Damage was also reported at the Arslantip Mound. In Akkaykadig, 11 people died, including 4 attributed to the second earthquake. At least 141 deaths were reported in Doganshahir. In Gaziantep, many of the historical sites were severely damaged, such as Gaziantep Castle, Sirvani Mosque and Liberation Mosque. In Nurdagi, nearly 2,500 people died and nearly 50% of the town was badly damaged or destroyed. An additional 30% of its building stock received moderate damage. Mass graves were created to bury the overwhelming number of dead. Gaziantep Ogazeli Airport was forced to restrict its service to rescue flights. 90% of houses were heavily damaged or destroyed in Sakchigozu, and 256 people died. In Hatay province, at least 55,589 buildings were partially or totally destroyed. In Antakya, about 3,100 buildings were destroyed, and up to 80% of the city's buildings required demolition. The districts of Kirikan and Iskenderun were razed. Collapse of the luxury Ronzans residence apartment trapped an estimated 800 people, and killed an unknown number. The runway of Hatay Airport was split and uplifted, causing flight cancellations. By the 12th of February, the Ankara Metropolitan Municipality completed repairs on the airport, allowing its reopening. 2 provincial hospitals and a police station were destroyed, and a gas pipeline exploded. The building that housed the Assembly of Hatay State was destroyed, as was St. Paul's Church and the Habibi Necker Mosque, while damage was reported at the Antakya Synagogue and the Hatay Archaeology Museum. Several dozen buildings in Guzulburg district and nearly every house in the central and Sebrail districts collapsed. Most of the squad and coaching staff of the local football club Hatayspor were initially trapped in the collapse of their headquarters in Antakya before being rescued, with player Christian Atsu and sporting director Taner Savut dying. In Iskenderun, an industrial city in Hatay province, a large fire at the port was reported on the 6th of February at 1700, believed to have originated from a container carrying flammable industrial oil, forcing the port's closure and the diversion of many ships. It was extinguished on 6 and the 8th of February, only for it to reignite the next day each time. It was finally extinguished on the 10th of February. A total of 3,670 containers were destroyed by the fire, and the port managing authority said it would take 3 months for operations to resume. Flooding occurred along the city shoreline, inundating streets up to 200 meters inland. The Cathedral of the Annunciation, seat of the Roman Catholic Apostolic Vicariate of Anatolia, was almost completely destroyed. There were no collapses or major damage in Erzin despite being closer to the epicenter than other areas of Hatay province. Multiple factors including strict building codes prevented destruction. An estimated 20,000 people fled to Erzin, increasing its population by about 50%. Mass burials occurred in Kahramanmaraş for more than 5,000 bodies. A city official said the mass grave would eventually be the burial ground for 10,000 bodies. The Interior Ministry later confirmed 941 buildings were totally collapsed. In Elbistan, 924 people died and 1,825 were injured. An estimated 2,000 buildings were destroyed. At Ordikdidi, a village in Pazarchik district, almost all single-story buildings were decimated. None of the 140 houses in the village were structurally stable. 34 people died in the village. At least 11 people died. 107 houses were destroyed and 70% of the building stock were damaged in Akinozu. In Afsin, at least 180 people died. At least 335 buildings including 90 in the city center were destroyed. The Afsin Elbistan thermal power plant was also damaged. In Arachek, a village in Goksun with a population of about 2,500 people, 86 died. In Adıyaman province, over 20,000 buildings and 56,600 apartments were destroyed. In the city of Adıyaman, 4 neighborhoods were razed. Many buildings along Ataturk Boulevard collapsed. The city hall, a 6th-century mosque and Golbasi District State Hospital were also destroyed. Ijaz Hotel, the largest hotel in the city, also collapsed, killing 65 people. Up to 10% of Adıyaman's population perished. The mayor of Kamor said the Karapınar and Bahçelievler neighborhoods were nearly destroyed. Destruction was also observed in Barbaros, Selikan, Sumerievler and Karapınar districts. In Harmanlı, a village in Golbasi district, 80 to 90% of it was destroyed. The second earthquake destroyed 3 buildings in the province. In Golbasi, 71% of the town's infrastructure was damaged or destroyed and 695 people were killed with over 400 injured, including 286 deaths in the town center. In Diyarbakir province, 8,086 buildings were damaged, required demolition or were destroyed. Diyarbakir Fortress, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, was also partly destroyed. The adjacent World Heritage Site of Hefsel Gardens was also damaged. Part of the Galleria complex in Yenishehir, which included a shopping mall and dozens of apartments, collapsed, killing 89 and injuring 22. At least 466 buildings were heavily damaged in Shanlurfa province. 201 were destroyed. Structures around the Pool of Abraham were damaged. The minaret at the religious shrine partially collapsed, sending rubble into the pools below and discoloring the water, which was also contaminated by sewage. In Ayubiye district, the minaret of the Ayup Prophet Mosque was damaged and removed. 33 people were killed in the collapse of the Osman Agan apartment. In Osmaniye province, of the 22,841 buildings surveyed, 1,739 were heavily damaged, destroyed or required urgent demolition. At least 1,088 of the 13,667 buildings examined in Merks district were destroyed, seriously damaged or needed to be demolished. In Kilis province, 119 buildings were destroyed and 138 others were heavily damaged. In Batman province, 218 buildings were damaged, and an additional 15 were completely destroyed. A heart attack death occurred in Kazitepe district, Mardin province. In Bengal province, several houses cracked and some livestock were killed by collapsing barns. In Samsun, damage occurred in Samsun Stadium. In Kayseri province, 48 houses, 11 barns and a school were affected, while 73 buildings were severely damaged. Several houses were damaged and a barn collapsed in Muse province. In Shivas province, the second earthquake destroyed a few houses. In Gyeongsang province, a 5-story building was damaged and evacuated. An unoccupied apartment in Elazig was damaged and later collapsed during the second earthquake. Among the dead included member of the Grand National Assembly of Turkey for Adıyaman Yakup Tuş, Yeni Malatyaspor goalkeeper Ahmet Eyüp Turkazlan, former Turkish national handball team player Simil Kutaya and his 5-year-old son, and Sol Senudiolu, leader of the Jewish community in Antakya, who died along with his wife. Former MP for Kahramanmaraş Sitki Güvenç died from earthquake injuries on the 9th of February. 3 Turkish soldiers died during rescue operations. 26 local journalists were among the dead. In Syria, at least 7,259 people died and over 14,500 were injured in Syria. Among the dead included 2,153 children and 1,524 women. The Syrian Ministry of Health recorded over 2,248 earthquake-related deaths and 2,950 injuries in government-held areas, most of which were in the provinces of Aleppo and Latakia. In rebel-held areas, at least 4,547 people died and 2,200 others were injured. The Syrian Network for Human Rights stated 73 medics, 5 media personnel, 62 workers in humanitarian agencies, and 4 civil defense personnel were among the dead. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said additional dead were buried before being registered and some victims died in hospitals. An estimated 5.37 million people across Syria may have been made homeless, while 10.9 million people, nearly half of Syria's population, were affected. More than 123 residential areas, villages, towns and cities were badly damaged. Many power plants, water facilities, hospitals and public infrastructure also sustained damage. At least 453 schools were damaged. Hundreds were killed in the towns of Jindyers and Atarib. A total of 805 people died and 1,131 were injured in Latakia Governorate. 105 buildings collapsed and 900 had total damage. In Jabla, at least 283 people died, 173 were injured and 19 buildings collapsed. 4 bodies were recovered and 15 bodies were in the process of recovery during debris clearance on the 10th of February. On the 11th of February, 6 bodies were retrieved from the rubble of a collapsed house along Al-Maliya Street. Civilians were stuck under the rubble for hours due to the lack of rescue teams in several villages such as Atarib, Besnia, Jindyers, Maland, Salkan and Sarmata. In Latakia Governorate, 142,000 people were affected. At least 805 people died and 1,131 others were injured. The region's governor said 103 buildings were destroyed and 247 were at risk of collapse. At Tishreen University, 10 students, 3 employees and a professor died. At least 48 people were killed in Hama. An 8-story building collapsed, killing 43, injuring 75 and trapping 125 others. The Associated Press, citing local residents, said the Afrin Dam had cracked. On the 9th of February at 4 o'clock, the dam burst and flooded the village of Al-Talal, which was exacerbated by heavy rains along the Afrin River basin. Nearly all its residents fled. About 500 families were displaced. According to Reuters, citing local residents, between 35 and 40 people died and most buildings in Al-Talal were damaged or destroyed by the earthquake. In Atarib, 148 bodies arrived at an underground hospital. A doctor at the hospital said some bodies were missing their head or limbs. Various archaeological sites in Tartus Governorate were damaged, including the Margit Castle, Kawabi Castle and Alika Castle, which partially collapsed. Damage to historical towers and infrastructure were also reported in Tartus and Safida. The president of the Syrian American Medical Society, Amjad Ras, said emergency rooms were packed with injured. In Idlib Governorate, one hospital received 30 bodies. In the village of Asmaran, Idlib Governorate, at least 260 people died, including 51 members of one family. At least 300 were injured and 100 were rescued. 15 buildings in the village were leveled and about 50% of its housing stock had cracks. Footballer Nader Jukadar, who played for the national team, was killed alongside his son when their home collapsed in Jabla. According to the International Rescue Committee, the earthquake struck when rebel-held areas were preparing for a blizzard and experiencing a cholera outbreak. In Aleppo, dozens of buildings collapsed and at least 444 people died, including 163 children. By the 8th of February, the bodies of 210 victims were returned to their families. The Directorate General of Antiquities and Museums said various archaeological sites across the city were extensively cracked or collapsed. Cracks were also reported in the outer facade of the Aleppo National Museum. In Atarib, Aleppo, the Syrian American Medical Society Hospital said 120 bodies were recovered. About 20,000 homes were affected in Aleppo, leaving 70,000 homeless. In Rajo, the doors and walls of a prison facility cracked. 20 prisoners, believed to be Islamic State members, escaped the facility. In Damascus, many people fled from their homes onto the streets. In the northern parts of the city, many buildings were cracked. Many buildings in Syria had already been damaged by an almost 12-year-long civil war. The Crusader-built Castle Margit suffered damage, with part of a tower and parts of some walls collapsing. Cracks also opened up in the walls of the cracked des Chevaliers Castle. The citadel of Aleppo was also affected. In addition, one of the towers of Sihun Castle near Latakia was destroyed. Meanwhile, all others were in danger. A total of 490 adobe buildings had partially or fully collapsed, while thousands of others were damaged in northwestern Syria. The minaret of the Grand Mosque in Kobani was also damaged. In Jindyers, at least 250 buildings were razed. Among the deaths were a family of 7. The only survivor was a newborn. Foreign casualties. At least 4,331 Syrians residing in Turkey were killed. According to Turkey's Presidency of Migration Management, 1.75 million Syrians live in southern Turkey, 460,150 in Gaziantep, 354,000 in Antakya, 368,000 in Şanlıurfa, 250,000 in Adana. Turkey's health ministry returned the bodies of 1,793 Syrian victims to their relatives in Syria, while thousands of Syrians were buried in Turkey due to difficulties transporting them to Syria. At least 11 Iraqi war refugees died in Turkey. Most Afghans killed in Turkey were refugees who fled the country after the Taliban takeover in August 2021. Among the deaths of Armenians was an entire family of 3 in Malatya. 10 Azerbaijanis were killed in Turkey, including 4 students in Malatya. An Italian family of 6, and an entrepreneur also perished. 19 students, 2 teachers and a parent from northern Cyprus died when a hotel in Adıyaman collapsed. 7 other Turkish Cypriots died in Hatay and Kahramanmaraş. Effects in other countries. In Lebanon, residents were awakened from their sleep. Buildings in the country shook for up to 40 seconds. In Beirut, residents fled their homes and stayed in streets or drove in their vehicles to flee from buildings. The earthquake damaged 16,200 buildings across the country, including 10,460 in Beirut and 4,000 in Tripoli. In Ashdod, Israel, a building was evacuated after cracks were observed in a pillar, and Champion Motors Tower in Bnei Brak was slightly damaged by the second earthquake. In Nicosia, Cyprus, some windows cracked, and the wall of a house collapsed, damaging 2 nearby vehicles. 6 Cuvier's-beaked whales were found dead along the island's northern coast on the 10th of February. The Department of Fisheries and Marine Research said there was a possible link between the beaching and earthquake, as these whales' echolocation system are affected by sea disturbances. The European Mediterranean Seismological Center said shaking was felt in Armenia, Egypt, Palestine, Georgia, Greece, Iraq, Jordan, Israel, and Russia. In Iraq, minor damage occurred in some houses and buildings in Erbil, and the city's citadel was severely damaged. In Egypt, tremors were strongly felt in the capital Cairo, and is considered the strongest earthquake felt since 1975. A 20 meters crack appeared in the Corniche in Alexandria. Aftershocks. On the 20th of February, a MWW 6.3 aftershock struck near Antakya, causing additional buildings to collapse in Samandag and further damage in Antakya. 8 people died in Antakya, Defne and Samandag. At least 562 were injured, including 18 in serious condition who received immediate medical attention before being taken to Adana and Dorçel. AFAD warned residents to stay away from the coast as there was potential for a tsunami of up to 50 centimeters. The mayor of Hatay said several people were trapped under debris. Among the structures damaged in Turkey included a bridge and an empty 3-story building in Iskenderun that collapsed. In Syria, 5 people died during stampedes and panic across several governorates, and at least 500 people were injured. The White Helmets said people in Aleppo and Idlib were injured by collapsed buildings. Some residents in Jindyris were injured after leaping off buildings. In northwestern Syria, damaged and abandoned buildings collapsed without casualties. Shaking was felt in Lebanon, Egypt, and Jordan. A MWW 5.2 aftershock occurred on the 27th of February, near Yesilyurt. It collapsed about 30 buildings in the town. 2 people died and 140 others were injured, 12 in serious condition. 1 fatality and 4 injuries were attributed to a factory collapse in Kahramanmaraş province. Estimations of losses. The USGS Prompt Assessment of Global Earthquakes for Response Service estimated a 35% probability of economic losses between $10 billion and $100 billion. There was a 34% probability of economic losses exceeding $100 billion. The service estimated a 36% probability of deaths between 10,000 and 100,000, 26% probability of deaths exceeding 100,000. For the second large earthquake, there was a 46% probability of deaths between 1,000 and 10,000, 30% probability of deaths between 100 and 1,000. The service also estimated a 35% probability of economic losses between $1 billion and $10 billion, 27% probability of economic losses between $10 billion and $100 billion. Risk layer estimated a death toll of between 23,284 and 105,671. According to geophysics professor Ovgun Ahmet Ercan, 180,000 people or more may be trapped under the rubble, nearly all of them dead. On the 11th of February, when the death toll was reported at about 28,000, United Nations Emergency Relief Coordinator Martin Griffiths said the death toll was expected to more than double. The World Health Organization said up to 26 million people may have been affected, 15 million in Turkey and 11 million in Syria. Shortly after the earthquakes, the Turkish lira value struck a record low of 18.85 against the US dollar, but rebounded to its starting position at the end of the day. Turkish stock markets fell. Main equities benchmark fell as much as 5% and banks fell 5.5% but recovered from the losses. The country's main stock market dropped 1.35% on the 6th of February. The Borsa Istanbul fell 8.6% on the 7th of February, and declined by more than 7% on the morning of the 8th of February before trading was suspended. The exchange then announced it would close for 5 days. Total costs of the earthquake damage in Turkey was estimated by the Turkmenfed organization to be $84.1 billion US dollars, $70.75 billion on rebuilding, $10.4 billion loss in national income, and an additional $2.91 billion loss in workforce. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said rebuilding would cost $105 billion. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development said potential losses of up to 1% of Turkey's GDP in 2023 could result. About half of residential property in the affected area is thought to be covered by compulsory earthquake insurance. The United Nations Development Programme estimated between 116 million and 210 million tons of debris must be cleared in Turkey. In Syria, the World Bank estimated $5.1 billion worth of damages, excluding economic impact and losses. Nearly half that cost was direct damage to residential buildings and 18% on infrastructure. Aleppo Governorate, the worst affected governorate, accounted for 45% of the damage cost, followed by Idlib and Latakia governorates. The amount of destroyed or damaged capital stock is about 10% of Syria's GDP. The World Bank also said that the reconstruction in Syria costs about $9.1 billion. Additionally, the economy may contract by as high as 5.5% on 2023. Aftermath in Turkey. Several tens of thousands of people across the region were left homeless and spent the night in cold weather. Officials plan to open hotels in Antalya, Alanya and Mersin to temporarily accommodate the affected population. Authorities were slammed by residents in Hatay province, who criticized the insufficient search and rescue efforts. Hatay Airport's runway was heavily damaged, making rescue efforts challenging. On the 7th of February, authorities said 1,846 people in the province have been rescued. Mosques in Turkey were used as shelters for people unable to return to their homes amid freezing temperatures. In Gaziantep, people sought refuge in shopping malls, stadiums, community centers, and mosques. Nearly 250,000 displaced persons resided in schools across Malatya province. At least 24 mobile kitchens from vocational schools in the province were distributed across the affected areas. Several Turkish humanitarian institutions such as ABAP from Hayluk Levant, the Turkish Philanthropy Funds, and Turkish Red Crescent also launched emergency appeals to help the victims. Turkish Airlines said it would provide free flights from the provinces of Adana, Adıyaman, Gaziantep, Kayseri, Diyarbakir, Şanlıurfa, Malatya, Elazığ and Kahramanmaraş. The Disaster and Emergency Management Authority opened an invitation for citizen volunteers to help with rescue efforts in the affected area. Thousands of volunteers arrived at Istanbul Airport. Bilal Xc, CEO of Turkish Airlines, said it has flown 11,780 volunteers on 80 flights to Adana, Gaziantep, Adıyaman and Şanlıurfa. Pegasus Airlines said it evacuated 30,771 people from the affected area on 169 flights between 6 and the 9th of February. Between 6 and the 11th of February, Turkish Airlines said it evacuated 139,438 people from the affected area on 790 flights. It carried 7,833 members of search and rescue and aid groups to the affected area on 1,595 flights. Search and rescue. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said on Twitter, search and rescue teams were immediately dispatched to the affected area. Interior Minister Süleyman Soylu urged residents to refrain from entering damaged buildings. On the 7th of February, President Erdogan declared a 3-month state of emergency in the 10 affected provinces: Adana, Hatay, Osmaniye, Kahramanmaraş, Gaziantep, Kilis, Şanlıurfa, Adıyaman, Malatya and Diyarbakir. The national government declared a Level 4 alert to appeal for international aid. According to the Disaster and Emergency Management Presidency, 25,000 search and rescue personnel were dispatched to the 10 affected provinces. At least 70 countries offered to help in search and rescue operations. Emergency services in Turkey rushed to search for survivors trapped under many collapsed buildings. By the 8th of February, more than 8,000 people were rescued from rubble across 10 provinces. About 380,000 individuals have taken refuge at relief shelters or hotels. An air aid corridor was established by the Turkish armed forces to mobilize search and rescue teams. Many military aircraft, including an Airbus A400M and C-130 Hercules planes, transported search and rescue teams and vehicles to the area. Food, blankets and psychological teams were also sent. Turkey sent an official request to NATO and allies for assistance. Over 53,000 Turkish emergency workers were deployed to the regions affected from the earthquakes. A team of 90 miners from Soma arrived at Osmaniye to provide assistance. The Izmir Metropolitan Municipality also sent dozens of vehicles and equipment. Poor weather conditions, including snow, rain and freezing temperatures, disrupted search and rescue efforts undertaken by rescue workers and civilians. Rescuers and volunteers wore winter clothing while searching for survivors. Damaged roads also slowed down aid delivery. On the 8th of February, Erdogan visited the town of Pazarcık, Kahramanmaraş province and Hatay province. He acknowledged shortcomings in the response to the earthquake, but denied that there was an insufficient number of personnel involved in rescue operations. He also described people saying they hadn't seen security forces at all in some areas as provocateurs. AFAD announced on the 19th of February that search and rescue efforts in most of the affected provinces had ceased. The chairperson of AFAD, Yunus Sezer, said efforts would largely be discontinued by the night of the 19th of February. Operations were still ongoing for 40 buildings in Kahramanmaraş and Hatay provinces by the 19th of February. Government assistance. The government said it would pay compensation to those who have lost their homes. President Erdogan said 15,000 in relocation assistance per household would be given to those whose homes were moderate, heavy or total destruction. Rent assistance of up to 5,000 would be given to homeowners and 2,000 to tenants. On the 9th of February, after touring the city of Gaziantep, Erdogan promised to rebuild destroyed homes of survivors within 1 year. He also said the government is working on temporary accommodation for those made homeless. That same day, force majeure was imposed in the affected region and tax obligations between the 6th of February and the 31st of July 2023 were postponed until the 31st of July 2023. On the 10th of February, while touring Adıyaman province, President Erdogan reiterated the promise to rebuild all homes within 1 year, and added that the government will subsidize rents for those unwilling to stay in tents. He later added that more than 141,000 rescue personnel, including foreign teams, were working in the 10 affected provinces, that 100 billion lira were allocated to the disaster response. On the 22nd of February, the Turkish government announced it plans to construct 200,000 homes in the cities of the 11 affected provinces and a further 70,000 in villages. Over 1.9 million people were rehoused in dormitories, guest houses, tents, hotels and containers. AFAD issued a statement on the 16th of February, detailing that 387,000 tents had been established in the affected area by local and international organizations. President Erdogan said 890,000 survivors were placed in dormitories and 50,000 in hotels. He added that 1.6 million people had access to shelter. Across the affected region, 162 container cities were established. The governor of Syria, Osman Bilgin, said the district would be demolished and reconstructed. Incidents. In the morning of the 7th of February, Turkey accused the People's Defense Units of having overseen an MRL attack on its border checkpoint, and that the Turkish army has responded with further attacks. The Kurdish Red Crescent and Kemal Saido from the Society for Threatened Peoples later accused Turkey of airstrikes against the Kurdish population around Tel Rifat also after the earthquake. Saido demanded from Turkey to open the borders to Syria for humanitarian aid just as they were open for Islamists. The Kurdistan Workers' Party declared a ceasefire in its conflict with Turkey. Co-founder of the PKK, Jamil Bayik, said, "Thousands of our people are under the rubble," and pushed for the focus on recovery efforts. He requested for all groups engaged to stop military actions and added that the PKK would not be engaged, as long as the Turkish state does not attack. On the 9th of February, 3 inmates were killed and 12 more injured after soldiers opened fire during a prison riot in Hatay. The prisoners were demanding to see their families affected by the earthquake. On the 11th of February, German and Austrian rescuers deployed to Hatay suspended operations, citing a worsening security situation due to the slow arrival of aid or sporadic clashes between armed groups. The teams later resumed operations when the Turkish land forces provided protection. On the 12th of February, rescuers from the Israeli search and rescue group United Hatzalah left Turkey, citing intelligence of a concrete and immediate threat on the Israeli delegation. On the 17th of February, a Syrian family of 7, including 5 children, were killed during a fire that struck a home in Nurdagi, Turkey, in which they moved to after surviving the earthquake. 7 other people were injured during the fire. A natural gas explosion at a building in Şanlıurfa on the 20th of February killed 2, left 5 injured and damaged businesses. Şanlıurfa's governor, Salah Ayhan, said due to the earthquakes, gas supply to the city was cut and an investigation was ongoing. A bus ferrying earthquake survivors from Hatay to Konya collided with a truck on the Tarsus-Adana Gaziantep motorway on the 23rd of February, killing 2 and injuring 6. Floods. Floods which struck the provinces of Adıyaman and Şanlıurfa in March killed at least 14 people. On March 15, Turkey's Interior Minister Süleyman Soylu said 5 people were missing. The floods swept away cars, affected homes and campsites housing earthquake survivors. 12 people, including 5 Syrians, died in Şanlıurfa. An intensive care unit in a hospital in the province was evacuated. In Adıyaman, 2 drowning deaths occurred when floodwaters swept away a Countainer home with a family. Over a dozen professional divers participated in search and rescue efforts in each province. 2023 elections. Before the earthquake, the government had planned the elections to be held on the 14th of May 2023, a month earlier than its latest possible date as a snap election. After the earthquake, doubts arose if elections could be held on schedule. On the 13th of February, Bülent Arınç of the AKP demanded the elections be postponed despite the constitution disallowing such a possibility in the absence of war. Arınç's declaration has been criticized by media outlets and politicians. It remains to be seen whether the governing coalition, with its 333 seats in parliament, can surpass the 400 number hurdle needed to pass such proposals by changing the constitution. On the 18th of February, AKP authorities stated that the elections would not be delayed. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu of the CHP opposed its postponement on constitutional grounds. Mustafa Tolga Öztürk, YSK member of the İYİ Party, stated that YSK does not have any power to postpone an election and only parliament has the right to do so, adding that Turkey had no more time to lose with the AKP. Selahattin Demirtas of the People's Democratic Party has described the postponement as a political coup. The declaration of state of emergency in the affected regions was also interpreted as a possible measure to postpone elections. Nevertheless, the earthquake led to the main anti-Erdogan coalition postponing its 13th of February meeting for the selection of its consensus presidential candidate. Education. On the 9th of February, the Council of Higher Education said education and training at universities in the affected provinces would be suspended until further notice. Student hostels managed by the General Directorate of Higher Education Credit and hostels would be used to house affected individuals. The Minister of National Education, Mahmut Özer, ordered a week-long closure of all schools in the country, which was later extended to 2 weeks. Schools in the affected provinces were suspended until the 10th of March. Students studying in schools located in the affected provinces would be transferred to other provinces of their choice. Sports. After the earthquake, Super League was suspended for over a week to mourn the victims. Clubs from affected regions. Super League clubs Hatayspor, Gaziantep FK, TFF First League Club Yeni Malatyaspor, Adanaspor, TFF Second League Club Adıyaman FK, Diyarbakırspor and TFF Third League clubs Kahramanmaraşspor, Osmanispor FK and Malatya Arguvan SK withdrew from competition. Chivas Belediyespor, Tarsus İdman Yurdu and Nigda Anadolu requested to withdraw but TFF did not approve their requests. On the 6th of February, it was announced the 2023 ISF World School Winter Games, which were due to be held in Erzurum, were cancelled due to the force majeure situation in the country. On the 10th of February, it was announced the 2023 Men's Euro Hockey Indoor Club Cup was cancelled due to the impact of the earthquake. The tournament was intended to be held from 17 to the 19th of February in Alanya. In an official statement, Minister of Youth and Sports Mehmet Kasapolu announced that every national championship would be suspended with immediate effect, until further communications. All 39 members of Northern Cypriot School Turk Marif Koleji's high school volleyball team, including players, teachers, parents and a trainer, died in the Kalapsa Hotel in Adıyaman. 3 players from Iran's national football team for the disabled died in Turkey. Hatayspor's Ghanaian winger Christian Atsu died in the collapse of Ronzan's residence in Antakya. His body was found on the morning of the 18th of February. Atsu was a former Chelsea, Newcastle, Bournemouth and Everton player. He died when the building he resided in collapsed. Basketball player Nilay Aydoğan died in Malatya. In the first game of the Super League after the earthquake between Fenerbahçe Istanbul and Konyaspor, the fans protested the government and shouted slogans for it to resign that even after the broadcaster of the game censored the voices of the fans, it was heard. In another game of a football club from Istanbul between Besiktas and Antalyaspor, the fans repeated their calls for the government to resign and threw cuddly toys onto the football field. Aftermath in Syria. Syrian media reported a large number of buildings collapsing in the northern Aleppo governorate, as well as several in the city of Hama. In Damascus, many people fled from their homes onto the streets. Syria's National Earthquake Center said the earthquake is the biggest earthquake recorded in its operational history. According to SANA, the state news agency, President Bashar al-Assad held an emergency meeting with his cabinet to organize a rescue plan for the most hit regions. Following orders from President al-Assad, all teams of the civil defense, firefighting, health, and public construction groups were mobilized to Aleppo. The Syrian government appealed to UN member states, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and other humanitarian organizations for international aid. Syria also requested for aid from the European Union's European Civil Protection Mechanism, according to Commissioner Yanis Lenarchik. The Syrian government, through its representative in the United Nations, said that it should be responsible for aid distribution in all areas of the country, including those held by the rebels. The UK government said it would deliver aid through its long-term partners, the White Helmets Civilian Defense Force. The US State Department said it would use its humanitarian partners on the ground. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs said damaged roads and logistical issues prevented the mobilization of international aid across the border from Turkey. Border crossings into Turkey remained closed on the 7th of February. Critically injured patients were unable to enter Turkey for medical attention. There were exceptions as to which persons could cross, including individuals holding touristic residence permits who could only cross by foot. The Bab al-Hawa border crossing was made accessible on the 8th of February, according to the UN. Some hotels, including in Latakia and Damascus, offered to accommodate to survivors free of charge and ensure basic necessities. Refugees and expatriates also opened their homes as shelters for people. Al-Sham Private University started an effort to receive people. Sports facilities, events venues, university dormitories and halls were also open to take in people. The Syria Trust for Development announced the establishment of shelters across many governorates. Volunteer groups inspected buildings for damage and distributed food items, blankets, and first aid essentials. Due to the high number of casualties, including trauma cases, many hospitals became overcrowded. Hospitals were already experiencing a shortage of medical supplies prior to the earthquake. Hospitals in many cities were forced to operate far beyond capacity. Many patients at hospitals slept on floors due to the lack of beds. The Ministry of Health dispatched medical convoys from the health directorates of Damascus, Rif Damascus Governorate, Kenitra, Homs, and Tartus, to Aleppo and Latakia to rebel-held areas. 28 ambulances, 7 mobile clinics, and 4 trucks carrying medical, surgical and emergency aid were also dispatched. Local charities across the country, which typically distribute food during the month of Ramadan, have been exhausted to their fullest capacity. One of these charities, SAED Initiative, planned to establish a charity kitchen to provide free meals for the rest of the year. Between 2,500 and 4,000 meals were distributed every day in Aleppo, and the charity plans to distribute up to 40,000 meals every day. Another charity in the city, the Al-Bir and Al-Ihsan charity, provided 1,500 meals every day. Over 2,000 Syria civil defense volunteers were sent to all the affected areas to conduct search and rescue efforts. With a lack of equipment and tools, they appealed to other humanitarian organizations for support. Officials on the 7th of February announced rescue and recovery efforts in Hama ended after 15 hours. Over 298,000 people were left without homes and 180 shelters were opened in government-held areas. About 30,000 people were housed in shelters in Aleppo. As of the 10th of February, no international rescue workers had arrived in rebel-held Jindaris despite official calls for help. United States sanctions against Syria relating to the blocking of banks and payment processors led to the banning of international charities and families attempting to send money to people affected in Syria. On the 7th of February 2023, the Syrian Arab Red Crescent urged Western countries to lift sanctions against Syria, saying the measures hurt civilians and humanitarian efforts during the earthquake recovery effort. The sanctions are a series of economic measures taken by the European Union, the United States, Canada, Australia, Switzerland, and the Arab League from the start of the civil war in 2011. They include an oil embargo and the freezing of financial assets of the state and government officials. There were requests to lift or suspend the sanctions to aid humanitarian efforts following the earthquake. On the 10th of February, the United States announced it would exempt sanctions against Syria for 180 days. The ease of sanctions was for all transactions related to earthquake relief efforts, according to the United States Department of the Treasury. The Syrian ministry responded in a statement that the U.S. decision was misleading and aims to give a false humanitarian impression, and that the facts on the ground proved its falsehood. Some commentators have argued that the sanctions do not pose a problem for the delivery of humanitarian aid to Syria. International humanitarian assistance began entering northwestern Syria on the 9th of February via Turkey through the Bab al-Hawa border crossing. The first convoy of 6 trucks carried tents and sanitary items. Turkey said it was working to open 2 additional border crossings. On the 10th of February, 14 trucks carrying aid crossed from Turkey into Syria, according to the United Nations. The United States Central Command announced it would cooperate with Syrian Democratic Forces to assist the affected population in Syria. On the 11th of February, World Health Organization Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus visited Aleppo, accompanying a shipment of emergency medical supplies. On the 12th of February, all schools across Syria, except for those in the affected areas, were resumed since the earthquake struck. Schools in Aleppo, Latakia, Hama and Idil remained closed. On the 14th of February, the Syrian government agreed to open the border crossings at Bab al-Salam and al-Rai for 3 months. International humanitarian efforts. Countries. Various countries and organizations have responded to the earthquake. At least 105 countries and 16 international organizations pledged support for victims of the earthquake, including humanitarian aid. More than 11 countries provided teams with search and rescue dogs to locate victims under the debris, and monetary support was offered as well. Arab League. Arab League Secretary General Ahmed Abul Gheit called for international assistance to help those affected by this humanitarian catastrophe. ASEAN. ASEAN Country Secretariat expresses its heartfelt sympathies and condolences to the governments and peoples of the affected countries, especially the families of the victims of the earthquake. ASEAN affirms its solidarity with the governments and peoples of Turkey and Syria in these trying times and stands ready to extend its assistance to the relief efforts. European Union, EU. The European Union's European Civil Protection Mechanism, in which Turkey participates despite not being a member of the EU, was activated at the request of Turkey. The EU dispatched 31 rescue teams and 5 medical teams from 23 member states to Turkey, committed €3 million and €3.5 million to Turkey and Syria respectively, and announced a donor conference to raise money. The Copernicus program was also activated to provide emergency mapping services and other help. North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that member countries were mobilizing support. The strategic airlift capability was used to transport search and rescue equipment. NATO deployed fully equipped semi-permanent shelter facilities to house displaced persons in Turkey. Flags at NATO headquarters were also lowered to half-mast. A vessel carrying the first 600 of 1,000 containers for temporary housing left Taranto, Italy for Turkey to accommodate at least 4,000 people. United Nations, UN. Several United Nations agencies announced coordinated responses to the disaster, including UNDAC, OCHA, UNHCR, UNICEF and IOM. The World Health Organization's Regional Director for Europe, Hans Kluge, said the organization's regional offices were assisting international efforts to transport medicine and relief equipment. The UN released $25 million from its emergency fund for humanitarian assistance in Turkey and Syria. A second $25 million grant was released for relief efforts in Syria. UN sent humanitarian aid to Syria through Turkey via the Bab al-Hawa border crossing. On the 14th of February, the UN appealed for €396 million to help survivors in Syria. World Bank. The World Bank said it would provide $1.78 billion in aid for Turkey to support the relief and recovery process. We are providing immediate assistance and preparing a rapid assessment of the urgent and massive needs on the ground, said World Bank President David Malpass. Reactions. Criticism of the Turkish government. The Turkish government was criticized on social media for allegedly trying to cover up the fact that there were not 2, but 3 main shocks above MW7. However, Professor Hasan Sözbalir, director of Doku's Eylül University Earthquake Research and Application Center, told Anadolu Agency that there were only 2 main shocks reaching above MW7 between 6 and the 17th of February 2023, but of the smaller quakes, there was one that reached MW 6.7. Additional allegations were made when the death toll in Turkey was at 41,000, could in fact be up to 5 times higher. The Justice and Development Party government was accused of manipulating the death toll of the earthquakes to mask the scale of the disaster amid growing criticism due to what many say was a delayed and ineffective response to the tragedy. The collapse of many newly constructed buildings caused public anger and doubts about the Turkish construction and contracting industry following seismic codes. After the 1999 Izmit earthquake, new building codes were enacted to make buildings more resilient to earthquakes. The quality of the concrete is often a factor in collapse, especially in older buildings, but the engineering and design of newer high-rise buildings, and improper placement of support columns and beams, may contribute to collapse. The building codes, last updated in 2018, required quality standards in engineering design, construction and material. There were complaints that the building codes were poorly enforced. After the earthquake, Erdogan had claimed 98% of the destroyed buildings were built in before 1999, and described it as the indicator of an improvement in the quality of building codes and enforcement. Erdogan's claim was criticized by civil engineer and earthquake engineering academic Haluk Sukyoglu, stating that field observations in more than half of the buildings in earthquake-affected areas being built after 2000 making Erdogan's claims unlikely, though accepting that concrete data on the destroyed buildings do not exist yet. The comparison of historical satellite images with those taken after the earthquake, especially of those showing the destruction in the newly built area of Western Kahramanmaraş, were used to dispute Erdogan's claim. In Adıyaman, the Minister of Transport and Infrastructure, Adil Karaizmalıoğlu, and Governor, Mahmut Kuhater, were met with protests by locals. The state car of the governor was also kicked by protesters. Turkish engineers previously warned that cities could become graveyards with building amnesty. Critics of President Erdogan said contractors of housing projects were allowed to skip vital safety mandates which put residents at risk. Videos from several years ago showed President Erdogan applauding housing projects which eventually collapsed. During a campaign stop in anticipation of the March 2019 local elections, he listed, among his government's top attainment, new housing in Kahramanmaraş. President Erdogan said, "We solved the problem of 144,156 citizens of Maraş with zoning amnesty." In another video, he said, "We have solved the problems of 205,000 citizens of Hatay with zoning peace." Before the 2018 general election, 3.1 million buildings were granted amnesty certificates, according to Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality Secretary General Assistant and City Planner, Bugra Gökçe. In the 10 affected provinces, 294,165 certificates were granted, 59,247 in Adana, 10,629 in Adıyaman, 14,719 in Diyarbakir, 40,224 in Gaziantep, 56,464 in Hatay, 39,58 in Kahramanmaraş, 4,897 in Kilis, 22,299 in Malatya, 21,107 in Osmaniye, and 25,521 in Şanlıurfa. After a destructive earthquake struck Izmir in 2020, Asia Times said the Turkish government generated $2 billion in profit since the latest zoning amnesty law was approved in May 2018. During that earthquake, there were 811,000 certificates linked to illegal construction in Izmir. The leader of the opposition in parliament, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu of the Republican People's Party, pinned responsibility for the scale of the disaster on President Erdogan. He demanded from the CHP mayors not to back down from providing bread and blankets to people in need and reject bureaucratic blocking as they did during the COVID-19 lockdown. It has also been reported that some donations from relief organizations arriving at the Adana airport were relabeled as assistance by the Disaster and Emergency Management Presidency or also the governing AKP. Questions also arose as to how an earthquake tax, levied by the Turkish government in the wake of the 1999 earthquake, estimated to have reached 88 billion lira and meant to have been spent on disaster prevention and the development of emergency services, were spent, given how the government has never given a public explanation. Some Kurdish and Alevi residents alleged discrimination and neglect in the government's recovery efforts. The pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party accused Turkish authorities of preventing equal distribution of aid and favoring areas inhabited majorly by people loyal to the governing AKP. Disaster management. AFAD, the state organ for the disaster relief, was criticized on the grounds of slowness during the first days of the earthquake. There were reports of unsuccessful attempts by people to contact AFAD. Emergency management academic Kubilay Kaptan stated that the delayed reaction of AFAD was mainly caused by the increasing centralization of Turkish emergency response agencies under the current government. According to Kaptan, numerous relief agencies were merged into AFAD in the past years, and since the implementation of the referendum, AFAD became part of the Ministry of Interior, losing its autonomy and self-governance. Kaptan added that the Ministry of Interior, responsible for making decisions, hindered the fast response since the organization required approval for its actions, contrasting more independent agencies like FEMA in the United States. AFAD was also criticized on the claims of inappropriate board of management, since some members of the board had no disaster management background. Ismail Palikolu, the general manager of Disaster Response Subdivision of AFAD, is a theologian who previously worked at the Directorate of Religious Affairs, was criticized by several politicians and media outlets. Another criticism was the late deployment of military resources. They were not mobilized for 2 days after the earthquake, and even then in what many considered in very modest amounts. In the past, local commanders were authorized to go into action unilaterally in the face of such a natural disaster until the current government changed the regulations. There were many instances where aid was forced to go through local governors, who were not elected but appointed by the government. In some instances, aid was held by the ruling party with the explanation that it would be managed by AFAD. There were reports of aid trucks stopped and not let through unless ruling party placards and signs were placed on them, including stickers of the president placed on individual aid packages. On the 16th of February, the district governor of Pazarcık, accompanied by the gendarmerie, seized aid stored in a distribution center established jointly by the HDP and the Hasankoka Neighborhood Assistance and Solidarity Association in presence of the head of the Diyarbakir Chamber of Industry, arguing they could not distribute aid independently. On the 9th of February 2023, the governing alliance between the MHP and the AKP approved a state of emergency in 10 provinces affected by the earthquakes. The opposition voted no to the measure, claiming that it was unnecessary since the provinces were already declared as disaster areas. A week after the earthquakes in Samandag, a coastal town in Hatay province, residents dug through the rubble to look for victims because of the slow and limited government response. "We have nothing left and the government barely helped us," one resident said. adding that assistance only came 48 hours after the earthquake. Media. NetBlocks announced that ICTA limited access to Twitter from Turkey, with Turkish government officials claiming disinformation. According to Reuters, citing an anonymous government official, the block was necessary, because in some accounts there were untrue claims, slander, insults and posts with fraudulent purposes. The block caused public anger as Twitter assisted in sharing information on arriving aid and the whereabouts of survivors still trapped in rubble. The People's Democratic Party said Twitter helped in organizing aid to the affected and the block would only cause more death. Ali Babakan, leader of the Turkey's opposition group, Democracy and Progress Party, also criticized the block. The Committee to Protect Journalists issued a statement critical of fines and penalties issued to Halk TV, Tele 1, and Fox over their coverage of the earthquake by the Radio and Television Supreme Council. In addition to the fines, both Halk TV and Tele1 were required to suspend airing of the shows that had criticized the government for 5 days. The CPJ's statement said that Turkey officials should revoke both the fine and penalties along with refraining from silencing the media for its earthquake coverage. Criminal investigation in Turkey. On the 7th of February, the Turkish police said they had detained 4 people over provocative posts aiming to create fear and panic on social media following the earthquake. It added that a wider investigation into social media accounts was ongoing, but offered no information on the content of the posts. The number of detentions increased to a dozen on the 8th of February. Following reports of property being ransacked by looters, authorities arrested 98 people for robbery or defrauding victims. Syrians have faced increased discrimination in the country, with some Turks blaming them for the looting. On the 9th of February, the Minister of Justice, Bekir Bozdag, said a judicial investigation into the collapse of buildings was opened. The probe attempts to hold accountable those who constructed the buildings or bore any responsibility for their collapse in the 10 hardest-hit provinces. Justice Minister Bekir Bozdag said, "Those who have negligence, faults and those responsible for the destructions after the earthquake will be identified and held accountable before the judiciary." Nearly 150 local prosecutors were authorized to establish units to investigate contractors, surveyors and other experts linked to the collapsed buildings. On the 11th of February, Turkey's Justice Ministry announced the plan to establish the Earthquake Crimes Investigation Bureaus. The bureaus aim to hold contractors and other responsible for construction, gathering evidence, recommendation experts, including architects, geologists and engineers, and inspecting building permits and occupation permits. Vice President Fuat Oktay said 131 individuals linked to the collapse of buildings were identified. By the 25th of February, 612 people were being investigated for their involvement in building collapses. 184 were arrested and awaiting trial. Those in jail included contractors and building owners and managers. On the 12th of February, the Adana Chief Public Prosecutor's Office issued arrest warrants for 62 people. 31 arrests were made on the 14th of February. In Malatya, city prosecutors issued arrest warrants for 31 people. The Committee to Protect Journalists published an article on the 14th of February covering journalists being detained and harassed for their reporting on the earthquake in Turkey. Some of those detained were being investigated for spreading misinformation, or for provoking the people into animosity and hatred in connection with their reporting. The owner of the Renaissance residence which collapsed in Hatay province was arrested in Istanbul while attempting to leave Turkey for Montenegro. In Gaziantep province, 2 people were arrested after being suspected of cutting down columns to make extra space in a building that collapsed. Bekir Bozdag said 163 people were being investigated for their alleged involvement. 8 people were arrested and awaiting trial while 48 were held in police detention. Another 7 were prohibited from leaving Turkey. Officials detained 2 people at Istanbul airport attempting to flee to Georgia. Among those arrested were a man and his wife who constructed several buildings in Adıyaman which collapsed. A contractor involved in developing the Bahar apartments in Gaziantep was detained in Istanbul after his inspections were deemed negligent. The owner of a construction company which built several buildings in Adana was apprehended in northern Cyprus. The majority of buildings that collapsed in Turkey were constructed before 2000, but some were constructed after that year. Following the 1999 earthquake, building construction followed new regulations and had improved materials. Şükrü Ersoy, a geology professor at Yıldız Technical University, said, "Corruption is high in the construction sector in Turkey. And therefore, there were abuses. However, not all local authorities were corrupted. For instance, in Erzin, which had a strict stance against allowing the construction of buildings that violated safety codes in addition to having endured other earthquakes with less damage, became a popular location for victims from other areas to flee to as no collapsed buildings had been reported a week after the quake." National mourning. President Erdogan declared 7 days of national mourning in Turkey on Twitter. 7 days of national mourning was observed in northern Cyprus, and 1 day in Bangladesh and Kosovo. Albania's Prime Minister, Edi Rama, said the 13th of February would be a day of national mourning. On the 13th of February, all overseas diplomatic missions of North Macedonia lowered the North Macedonian flags to half-mast. Criticism by the Syrian government and opposition. Syrian government officials and state-run media blamed United States and European Union sanctions against the country for the lack of humanitarian aid and hampering rescue. On the 10th of February, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad accused Western countries of having no regard for the human condition. The U.S. Treasury said its sanctions contain robust exemptions for humanitarian efforts, in the first place, and that after the earthquake it issued a blanket authorization for relief efforts. The United Nations has also been criticized for its policy of focusing aid shipments solely to the regime, at the expense of Syrian lives in opposition-held territories. Idlib region, under the control of Syrian Salvation Government, was one of the hardest-hit territories. Assad regime's policy of besieging northwest Syria, which blockades the supply of food, medicines and other humanitarian supplies, has further deteriorated the crisis in Idlib. Abu Muhammad al-Jilani, commander of the SSG-aligned Tahrir al-Sham rebel militia, criticized aid agencies of neglecting the situation in Idlib and called on the international community to be more proactive in reconstruction and relief efforts, adding that the United Nations needs to understand that it's required to help in a crisis. Upon traveling to the Bab al-Hawa border crossing bordering the rebel-held territories, UNOCHA Under-Secretary Martin Griffiths stated on the 12th of February that, "We have so far failed the people in northwest Syria." As of the 13th of February, Ankara and the Turkish-backed Free Syrian Army were accused of blocking aid convoys sent by the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria from entering the northwest region. The United Nations criticized Russia's attempts to block delivery of aid through checkpoints to rebel-held territories. Secretary-General Antonio Guterres urged the Security Council to immediately permit aid flows into northwestern Syria. United States appealed for the immediate opening of all closed checkpoints to send in relief efforts to all parts of Syria, calling for an emergency UN Security Council meeting to increase humanitarian assistance through Bab al-Hawa and open up more border crossings for the entry of UN aid. Stefan Dujarric, a United Nations spokesperson, said on the 14th of February, "Some aid is getting into the northwest," pointing to 58 trucks that arrived with aid through the Bab al-Hawa crossing. However, the organization does not possess heavy equipment or search and rescue teams. He stressed that the international community as a whole needs to step up to get that aid where it is needed. Health concerns. Due to below-freezing temperatures in the affected areas in both Turkey and Syria, the mayor of Hatay, Lutfu Savas, warned about the hypothermia risk. In Adıyaman province, some residents trapped under rubble died from hypothermia. Concerns arose regarding the possible spread of infection in areas where sanitation facilities were damaged or unfunctional. Due to water shortage experienced in both countries, many survivors could not shower. International health organizations said the shortage of clean water would be a public health risk. The World Health Organization said water shortage increases the risk of waterborne diseases and outbreaks of communicable diseases. On the 18th of February, Turkey's health minister Fahrettin Koca said there was an increase in intestinal and upper respiratory infection cases, but numbers did not pose a serious threat to public health. At a stadium serving as shelter in Kahramanmaraş, a clinic managed by 15 to 30 medics attended up to 10,000 patients in the day. The clinic provided tetanus shots and sanitary items to residents. Many people at the stadium were unable to shower and the 6 toilets were unable to accommodate to the large number of people. In Antakya, residents said more portable toilets were needed. Health authorities in Turkey had to ensure earthquake survivors were free of disease. The World Health Organization collaborated with local authorities to monitor the rates of waterborne diseases, seasonal influenza and COVID-19 among the affected.